Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Adam Lowther, and we have back for a second time Zach Kallenborn, who is a drone expert, and Zach is also a fellow at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, and he writes prolifically, speaks on podcasts, delivers talks to West Point and other places. He is a widely sought after drone guy who knows and writes and thinks prolifically about the topic. Welcome back, Zach.
Thanks for having me.
So the reason we wanted you back is because we just had an incident in which a Chinese spy balloon flew across the United States. Now, it's not your typical drone that we've been thinking and talking about in terms of what's going on in the Ukraine or some of the topics you and I talked about last time. How might we use drones for deterrence purposes or delivering nuclear weapons or whatever the case may be. So it's certainly a different topic. And I wanted to get into, you and I prior to today talked about that there are some illicit drones flying over submarine bases that we don't understand. So it's more than just the Chinese spy balloon. There's quite a bit of activity in these unmanned systems that we as a nation are sort of like, what is going on? What is the purpose of it? What's up with this? So let's start with the Chinese spy balloon. What was your take on this event?
Yeah, it was interesting on like a couple levels. So, first I just thought it was curious, like, why is that? Why is it a balloon? Like, China has a bunch of spy satellites, they have drones, they have all sorts of other things. Like, what are they using a balloon for? I thought that was kind of interesting. The more that I thought about, like, it kind of makes sense. Like, one of the challenges you get with like satellites is that they're relatively predictable. The orbit, which also means folks at the military bases know the orbit. So you can say, okay, I know this is going to come at 3 p.m. or whatever on Tuesday, and then take precautions. Take your sensitive stuff so that it's not visible. You might even mess with them, like draw pictures in the snow or whatever. Like, we see you, that type of thing. But you know when it's coming. But with a balloon, you have that sort of wind to it, that element of like, we don't really know where it's going to go. And so it then becomes a lot more unpredictable when and where it's going to be there. And especially in this case, it sounds like, the balloon was equipped with some like fancy communication intercept type thing. And with, communications, those are, functioning on like electromagnetic spectrum. So they're going in a broad array. So even if your balloon doesn't fly like exactly overhead of your military base or your nuclear site, it might be close enough still to sort of pick up and intercept some of the signals that are coming out. So that was the first interesting part. I think the second one was the amount of reaction to the incident. I thought was quite fascinating. It was all over the news, multiple like breaking news stories all over the place when there's even slight updates on what's going on, people following closely. And it wasn't even just national security wonks, which was kind of what I suspected at first. You saw like those images of like guys, standing outside in their yard, like pointing guns at the sky, like that sort of, it's really silly, but like the way that it like captured the imagination. And initially I kind of thought it was like kind of stupid, to be blunt. Like, China has been spying on us on a myriad of ways for decades. Like, this isn't new by any means. But what I do think is interesting about it is like the visualness of it, like where you can like literally go in your yard and look up in the sky and sort of see it like crossing over. There's a way that you can see it in a much, much more direct way than, just a generic news report that says like, oh, hey, look, Chinese hackers broke into, whatever. That's much more abstract. You don't have that experience of it. So I think to some extent it's sort of like a wake up call to a lot of folks who just weren't paying as much attention. Like, oh, Chinese spying is maybe kind of a big issue here.
Now, I'm not a expert on like how we manage airspace and the laws that govern airspace. Maybe you know a bit more about this from, working in the drone space. And so I guess my question would be, from a legal standpoint, is there, I think I heard that the balloon was at like 60,000 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And so would that still, where does sovereign U.S. airspace end and sort of the wild beyond begin in terms of what you can and can't do? Because at 30,000 feet, where aircraft are flying between 30 and 35,000 feet, that's regulated airspace. But is 60,000 feet regulated airspace? What's the rules on that? Do you know?
Yeah, that goes a little bit beyond my personal knowledge there. But, certainly there is that sort of like questionable gray space, right? Because, we certainly have satellites flying over all the time and we don't go and shoot those down. That said, if an actual like Chinese fighter jet sort of flew over, that might be a little bit more of an issue. So a little bit, that goes a little bit beyond my personal knowledge though.
Yeah, I mean, because I wonder, so as we think about sort of the activities of the Chinese, the Russians, and what they're doing with unmanned systems, aerial systems, there have been a number of instances beyond the spy balloon. And, apparently this has happened before, and it's been, General Van Herk said that the Northcom commander said that I think he said in some testimony that they had not notified the president of them in the past, or that they had not been able to track it effectively. I can't remember exactly what he said, but there was problems, and they did admit this has happened before. I do wonder, beyond just the balloons, we've had incidents that I think you've looked at and worked on, where we've seen drones that flew over some of our very sensitive, like submarine bases. What all flown? I think they've flown around our ships at sea. Mm-hmm. So what all's going on there?
Yeah, so there's been a whole lot of concerns there, and that's been happening for a number of years. Yeah, there's been a number of sort of mystery drone swarm sightings. I'll be pedantic and note that it's not actually a drone swarm. They're not communicating with one another, but that's a separate issue entirely. But point being, there was at least a whole lot of drones that were flying around a number of sensitive sites, to include Bangor Kitsap, the base in northern Washington that's home to many of our Trident submarines there, and doing so in very suspicious circumstances, like, I think it was either like at night or like just before nightfall, and like a whole lot of drones at once and happening like frequently over time. And we know that there's been a lot of these just in general. And reality is we can't really respond terribly well. I think it was FBI Director Christopher Wray. I'm not 100% sure. I might be getting that wrong. But there was a recent, some congressional testimony from some senior leaders noting that there's like thousands of incidents across the country of like sort of suspicious drone sightings, and like the ability to actually respond to them is very, very limited. It's something like 1 or 2% actually get responses. In many of those cases, it's probably just, Steve, hobbyist, kind of hanging out, playing with his drone. But when we're talking about like a military base in the minute, like in the night or near that, like, sure, I buy that like some of those cases are, some random guy who just doesn't know any better. But like, it should be pretty obvious to most people that flying over a military base with a drone in a really suspicious context, like the middle of the night, is a really dumb idea. So to me, I think there's a very high probability that at least some set, I won't speculate at all, like whether it's like most of these, 1 or 2%, but I would be extraordinarily surprised if none of those incidents were not like Chinese, Iranian, Russian, some sort of adversary flying these down, doing these. And at least to my knowledge, there hasn't been any significant responses. Like, in this balloon incident, we shot it down. We looked at what was there and confirmed, yep, this is pretty clearly a Chinese spy balloon. Like there's a bunch of random advanced communication systems that are not the type of thing you would have on a weather balloon. I'm not aware that we've done that with some of these drones that have been flying around these bases, but it seems like we should, because I think it presents some of those same sort of concerns where, with a satellite, it's predictable. People can take folks in the bases can take countermeasures. With these drones, they just like show up in some random day just flying around. What are they looking at? What are they seeing there? Even some basic stuff could be really useful, like knowing, when and where our submarines are leaving, because then you can start trying to figure out more effectively where they're located. And in turn, then if you know where our nuclear submarines are located, that's certainly going to be potentially quite harmful for our second strike deterrence. Now, there's obviously a lot more steps than that. Like just seeing it with a drone is a lot. There's a lot more to it than that, but it can at least help sort of build that logical chain to do so.
Yeah, I wonder, do we have the capabilities? And, I think about it sort of from, initially from a paparazzi sort of standpoint, where the paparazzi were in this, they were doing this 10 or 15 years ago with drones, flying them over people's, famous people's houses and looking into their backyards. And apparently in most states, it's illegal to shoot down drones. You're not allowed to shoot them down. But I wonder sort of where does, is there a movement to change the law that would allow, individuals, government agencies to deal with drones? Is there any commercially available technology? So, if I, for example, have a pesky neighbor that, keeps harassing me with a drone and I want to take it down, what can I do to do that? And whatever is available to us, I'm sure the government would have much better capabilities to take down drones. Is the Navy, for example, putting up systems to take down these drones that may come over?
Yeah, so for what you and I can do, the answer is pretty easy: nothing. So current under federal regulations, unmanned drones, even those like little quadcopters that are like yay big, are treated as aircraft, which means if you do anything to them, it's equivalent of attacking like a full aircraft. Now, whether it's actually treated that way, like in prosecution and in the courts, that sort of thing, I don't really know.
But aren't aircraft not supposed to fly below 1,000 feet? So when drones are at 80 feet, that would still be treated.
No, so they're allowed. I don't know the exact law, but at least with drones, there's a flight cap up to 400 feet. But for what I believe it's specific statutes around interfering with aircraft that, like, when it comes to, like, say, like hacking or something like that, that are applicable equally to drones as well as like manned aircraft. And so the end result is basically we can't do anything. And even the local police can't do anything. Under federal law, the only folks who have counter UAS, counter drone authority, is select federal agencies. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones. Like Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense does have that authorization. Who else? Like Department of Justice does, but like your local police, they do not. So if you call 911, they're going to show up. They're like, I don't know what to do with this. Now they, like, if they believe for whatever reason that there's like something harmful, like, yes, they might be able to, like, treat it as like, a general, harmful type incident where you try to locate the perpetrator and, hey, what's going on? That's plausible. But if it's like, it's just a drone that's just flying there, like, you really can't do anything so long as they're, following the various federal laws. Now, when it comes to Department of Defense, like, they do have that authorization to shoot down some of these drones. I don't know that they've taken it, and I also don't know where the lines are. Sort of like as we were talking a little bit about, sort of like with the altitude issue. I believe, but I'm not 100% sure on this, but I believe the Department of Defense has to, like, the drones have to be over Department of Defense controlled airspace to take those actions. But if you think about a drone, like if they're, say, just using a camera and they're pointing it, you don't need to fly over the airspace. You kind of just, fly it up at a good enough angle that you can kind of see over the walls and see what's going on. So you don't actually potentially need to be in that engagement, in that like area where like shoot down mode is going on. And I know certainly that a lot of the Department of Defense has struggled, like at least with some of these open source reporting about these drone sightings. There's been a number of quotes where like sailors, soldiers, airmen, like there's like, I don't know what to do, like, because I don't know if this is a threat, right? Because if it's like, a ways out, relatively close, but not like over the military base, like who is this person? Is it a hobbyist? Is it, Joe who is really into military stuff? Like, do they know? What is the action that they're going to take? And they don't necessarily know. There has been some recent changes to this. President Biden put out a new counter UAS plan last year, I want to say, expanding some of these authorities, but not in a drastic way. Like, I think like most of the stuff in there seemed good, but it was like more just sort of step incremental increases. Like, I think TSA has increased authority to shoot down drones, and they're also doing like a pilot program for, I think, 10 states or 10 cities rather, to allow them to start, like, allow local officials to do counter drones. To me, that's not really all that much and not really a big deal, but it's worthwhile. Yeah, and I suppose I should add, sort of, to go back a little bit. So part of the concern that you run into with why folks are hesitant about like shooting some of these things down is not only the issue of like, okay, who is this? What is this actor? But also with some of these systems that are out on the market, the most common counter UAS system that's out there are jammers. I think like 54% or so of the specifically designated counter drone systems are jammers. Basically, that is, they sever the link between the drone and the operator. The problem there is that basically it's just an electromagnetic spectrum thing, like, right? It's just jamming everything on that particular frequency, which means it's jamming everything on that frequency, which could include like, police and law enforcement communication systems. It could be like, technical systems used for like airports. It could be, relays for ambulances, like that type of thing. It could be all sorts of things that like we kind of need. So that's partially why, it's so restrictive. And why we don't want like just everyone getting access to those. But it also end up having that result of lots of these drone incursions without too much response.
So we're talking to Zach Kallenborn about the Chinese spy balloon and then the potential for these drones that we've seen flying over Bangor, Kitsap, and other bases. But it's time to take a break, so we'll be right back. This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the Anwa Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. All right, and we're back talking to Zach Kallenborn. So, Zach, as you think about the Chinese spy balloon, the drones we've seen flying over military bases, and you think about potential solutions for problems like this, what comes to mind is how you think we should probably address these kinds of problems?
Yeah. So there's sort of a few levels to that. So, with this particular incident, I don't know that we really need like a big, gigantic response in that, like, it was a weather balloon, like it's noticeable. And I think we want something public would be good. But like, it's also like, we're not starting a war over that. And that doesn't seem appropriate to me, but there might be some like interesting or clever things to do. One I was sort of toying around as well. China said it was a weather balloon, so let's send them back, and they want it back. So let's send them a weather balloon back, and if they want the communication stuff back, we can do that, but they have to tell us what is this communication? Because otherwise, how are we going to replace it if we don't know what it is and what it does? So let's have them tell us that. And then maybe we'll send it back to them. Something like that sort of shows we're responsive, something public, that gives them a little bit offensive, but without we're not starting a war over this. So that's sort of with the short term type thing. Bigger picture, I think we need to start take advantage of this clearly did get massive amounts of attention.
Oh, sure.
And I think people are much more aware of Chinese spying. So I think there's definitely the political support to take much more aggressive action to support counterintelligence against Chinese spying more broadly, potentially as well being more aggressive against China with their own espionage, whether that's, developing human intelligence sources, doing our own cyber hacking, that type of thing. Maybe even send our own balloons hey, it worked for them. So let's, do a little bit of that ourselves. A nice little sort of, tit for tat there to show that we're not going to accept this. We're not going to take it out of control, but we're going to respond to what you're doing.
I wonder if there was this guy, I think you're younger than me, and I wasn't even born when it happened, but there was this guy, Gary Power, and he sort of had this unfortunate incident where he was trying to, fly over the Soviet Union in a U-2 and got shot down. So,
yeah.
So, I mean, we, the United States, do have some experience flying over hostile countries. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, and my guess is probably, there's probably a little bit more of that as well. But, sort of stepping up some of those activities. And I don't know the details too much. So, I can't say too specifically. And maybe we are already doing that. But, putting more resources and attention to doing that, I think would be good. I think also leveraging this incident for broader security practices. There's been a whole lot of discussion around how we're improving cybersecurity and how do we do that for critical infrastructure and broader society. Using this as a way to say, hey, look, there's a lot of Chinese spying going on. Obviously, it's this is not a cybersecurity incident, but you sort of go, okay, Chinese spying in general is
really
absolutely
worrisome.
We need to look across the board. And probably there's some congressional approaches that, do big hearings or something on Chinese espionage to talk about this. And when it comes to some of these drone incidents, I think we should also take a little bit of a lesson learned here from the balloon. I thought it was a good idea that they shot it down. I go back and forth on whether it made sense to shoot it down way before it actually was moving around, but I can see some value in collecting information on it as it's going. But, I thought the shooting it down was good. And I think we should do some of that with these drones that we're seeing around, is take a more aggressive response just to see what it is. Maybe it is a hobbyist drone and be okay, our bad, we'll replace your drone. Here's $50 or whatever it was to replace it. But, if we see, okay, there's some strong indicators that, this is actually a larger spy campaign, that would be quite useful, I think, for us to know.
Yeah, I mean, we do know that both the Russians and the Chinese have capabilities in the United States for signals collection. I'll give you a great example. They wanted to buy a company that we later found out was affiliated with the PLA, was trying to buy a building right close to the Pentagon. And they were, we'll find buildings around the Pentagon where all of a sudden you'll find antennas and dishes that pop up on the tops of these buildings. So they're clearly in this country trying to collect. We've heard about the 1,000 Talents programs. I mean, how many professors in the United States have been convicted of working with the PLA lately? So how much industrial espionage have we seen? And it's, I often wonder if we have fundamentally failed to deter the Chinese because, when they see us doing essentially nothing in cyber espionage and cyber crime and in, some of the human intelligence and the industrial espionage. And then do they ultimately get to the point where they say, well, we'll start flying balloons over and collecting signals. They're probably not going to do anything anyways. They don't seem to be doing stuff elsewhere. And then, if they shoot it down, we're out a few $1 million, but we'll have collected some, signals on these given, sites.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think, looking broadly at some of the solutions to this, one of the interesting questions that I saw some senior defense officials raise in the New York Times was looking at the supply chain issues. I thought was really interesting. Okay, this advanced communication system, are there Western or other U.S. made components on this? And just bet I would be really surprised if they weren't. Like, just as a matter of fact, like, our supply chains are so globalized. We have so many international companies that, like, there probably are. I mean, we saw recently that with the Iranian Shaheeds that have Shaheed drones, I should say, that Russia has been using to attack Ukraine. Quite a lot of those components are actually from American companies. And I think that's part of the challenge we get to now. And I'm sure Chinese are using other American entities, often legally, to conduct some of these spying. So taking a hard look at like where this technology is going, what are the components what are the components that we as a country are providing to support this, I think is a really good thing, and look at what are the things we can do to try to stop it. I'm a little skeptical just by the nature of global supply chains that we can really like plug up. It's not like it's a single hole that we just, put the stopper in and we're done. This is more like a barrel with 1,000 little pinpricks in it where you got stuff sort of coming out everywhere. So, but I think I'm sure there's opportunity to take hard looks at that. We've seen some interesting reports from think tanks recently, like thinking more seriously about sort of export controls and what does that look like in today's world where, not only globalized like technology, but also sort of talent, open source research, that type of thing. And, and I think we need to take a stronger look at those mechanisms.
Yeah, it's China's an interesting case in particular because if you think back to the Cold War, we didn't have millions of Soviet citizens coming to the U.S. to get advanced, university degrees in areas that would be bad for us. We didn't have, millions of Soviet citizens working in the technology and industrial sectors in this country. We didn't sell the Soviets advanced technologies. All the things that we do with China, we didn't do with the Soviet Union. And it's part of the reason that they were never able to catch us technically. And if you look at China today, even now they cannot manufacture advanced chips. I mean, they're primarily manufactured in Taiwan, which is probably part of the reason they want the island. But there's a whole lot of advanced stuff that they cannot manufacture, but they can assemble it. So, and we're selling it to them to allow them to assemble it for nefarious purposes.
Yeah, that aspect of know-how is really interesting, and I think a tough one. Like I share your same concerns, and to me, I think that's sort of a product of lessons taken from sort of during the Cold War, as well as I think even looking back to like World War II, that type of thing. Like I recall, after World War II, we sucked up a whole bunch of, German, Japanese, I think some Soviet scientists as well, like, bring them over here and let's have them do awesome stuff for us and let's learn from those experiences. And some of those have occasionally been kind of morally questionable. You talk about, say, like the Japanese folks who worked on the bioweapons programs. Like, I don't know how I feel about that, but at the end, like, they have the knowledge. Like, it's not like it's going away. So if we can make positive use of it, let's do it. So, I kind of see a little bit of that, like, in that at the moment where, like, okay, yes, these folks are coming over, but, if it turns out, hey, they love America, I do, so why not them too? If they bring that know-how to us and, we bring their best and brightest, like, hey, that's good for us if they're not working over there for China. That said, to what extent China is sort of maintaining those connections and, what happens if that person's like, yeah, my family's back over there. I want to, maybe not, I don't want to stay here. I'm going to go back over there. And then, they're like, okay, well, they still have that knowledge and bring it over there. So I think it's a tough balance because you got to balance those two things of like, yes, we want to bring over the best and brightest, but at the same time, we want to make sure that, that best and brightest is not actually, working for the PLA behind the scenes. But definitely taking a look at like some of that, like how do we balance that effectively? And my guess is some of that sort of comes out in like security clearance type things of, what's the background, that type of thing, before giving access to a lot of like sensitive stuff. And, some of the research, depending on what it is, may end up being sort of beneficial no matter where it's coming from. So if you think about like really open source, early academic research, right? Like some of the like fundamental research on say like artificial intelligence or even drones, like that's going to get published no matter where it is in an open source academic journal. Or not necessarily open source, but like a publicly available academic journal. So to some extent, everyone's going to get the benefit from those things.
So, we're about at the end of the show, and I want you to give our listeners sort of your 2 cents on what to make of the balloon event and then some of these sort of unexpected drone events that we're seeing that could be sensitive. What should they think? Should they do anything? How should they understand these events?
Yeah, I think the simple description, I guess 3 words, is wake up call is what I would call it. In and of itself, I don't think the balloon incident is really that big of a deal. But where I think it's significant is sort of the symbolism of it, that sort of awareness, that attention that it's gotten across the country in a much more real way than many of these previous incidents that in many ways are equally, if in some cases, perhaps even more brazen. If you talk about almost hitting some of our warships, that type of thing. But it has that attention to it. And the takeaway should be, how do we leverage that sort of wake up, and how do we deal with it, and how do we use that to sort of support increases in broader counterintelligence activities, to identify and recognize some of these Chinese spying concerns and be more effective at dealing with them. And I think, the folks listening to this, that part works for the policy folks who are listening to this, but for just folks who are interested, I think just read more broadly, understand, look at some of these incidents, with these drone systems, look more broadly at the, history of Chinese spying. This is hardly the first time we have had the OPM hacks back in, I think, 2015, I want to say, where, the clearance information from, I think, millions of folks were stolen by some Chinese hackers. This is not the first time that there's been some concerns here. Looking at that big history and looking holistically at okay, what does this show us about the big picture of U.S.-China relations and what that means going forward, especially in the espionage realm?
All right. Zach Kallenborn, thanks for joining us. Senior or fellow at the National Institute for Deterrent Studies. And of course, a prolific writer on all things drone. And you may catch him on other podcasts or on some of the videos of him giving talks on drone swarms and all sorts of interesting technologies. Thanks for joining us, Zach.
Thank you for having me, sir.
And to you, the listeners, thanks for joining us.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Grunthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nuclearcast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.